Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're well. My name is Nathaniel Graywood, and I lead a team called Advanced Analytics based in New York for Twitter. Thanks to the MRMW for having me, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. I hope you find this at least somewhat insightful. Now, I wanted to start by asking you all to think about your most recent household purchase and maybe some of the reasons why you bought it. Perhaps you saw an ad, maybe you'd bought a version previously and you just needed an upgrade, or maybe you read a review of some description. My latest and most recent purchase was the Dyson V8 Hoover, known as the Animal. I had an old Hoover, which was just that, very, very old and heavy, and it finally packed up. So I got a recommendation from a friend for this one, and to be honest with you, I'm never going back. It's completely changed my life and probably my apartment as well. But my first thought after purchasing it was, wow, it's been a long time since I've had a recommendation of this nature. But then that was quickly followed by my second thought was, well, maybe it isn't that rare, and it's just that the way in which recommendations are communicated has changed, as the way that we communicate in general has changed. So this concept of word of mouth has obviously been around for years and way before my last Hoover purchase. In fact, one of our senior analysts found a paper, and this paper detailed how neighbors would exchange information over their backyard fences to one another about what air conditioning units they would buy. And so you had these clusters of Philadelphia that were particularly brand loyal to certain brands of air conditioner, and it was very kind of locally represented. So this core behavior to share information and talk about brands it still exists, it's still there, but it's just the way in which it's communicated has changed. I'm sure there are still people who are talking over their backyard fences. I think Twitter exemplifies this change in communication. Our purpose is to serve the public conversation, and that means that every day people come to Twitter to start, read, and join conversations about what's happening, and that includes conversations around brands. I think it's important just to hone in on the word public here, because I think that's the critical word that really exemplifies this change, because today conversations aren't just a one-to-one over the backyard fence, but that conversation is visible to millions, and simply by reading that or liking a part of that conversation, you are participating in that exchange. Or it could just be one person who starts a conversation and millions of people responding. So the actual shape and dynamics of the conversation are very, very much different on our platform. I wanted to give a couple of brand examples just to bring this to life. Those of you who are gamers yourself or have children that are gamers could not have ignored the PS5 launch last year, and PlayStation came to our platform to make this announcement. Now, PlayStation's a brand that is actually quite consistently discussed and mentioned on our platform, but during this announcement, mentions of PlayStation tripled in the US, and it globally became the #1 trending hashtag, which is a huge, huge amount of conversation. Similarly for GM and their launch of the latest Hummer, again, this is a conversation on our platform, but compared to the day before, there was a 2000% lift in mentions of Hummer. And just in the hour after the announcement, there was 2,000 tweets alone about this new model. So some big numbers there, but what does it actually mean? What do those lifts mean? Do they actually translate into any business outcomes or business KPIs? Can a brand actually affect anything within that conversation? And if so, how? So throughout this presentation, I'm going to take you some of the work that we've done in this space and some of the techniques we've used to answer some of these questions. As hopefully all of you will know, that there's not one perfect research solution that can answer all these questions, much as I wish that there was. So we've come at this from several different angles. Also, in that investigation, several other questions cropped up. So hopefully at the end, I can give you a sneak peek as to what's going to come next and what our program is like for the rest of the year. But before I go into too much depth there, I wanted to pause, with this being the conference for innovation, to share a really key and critical piece of innovation that's happened at Twitter that's really underpinned all these studies. So we have this internal system called semantic core, and this is where tweets are dynamically tagged with entities. And this allows us to instantly understand which tweets are about specific things. Now, those things could be the people in the tweet, the event surrounding the tweet, TV shows, video games, and of course, in this instance, brands. I wanted to give an example of this, and it's actually helpful to use a non-brand example to illustrate the point. So here's a tweet from the recent Golden Globe Awards and the entities in which it's tagged with. So you can see that there's an entity for the Golden Globes itself, for the actor, Gillian Anderson, who won this particular award, all the way down to a broad category of entertainment. So hopefully you can see how this works and why this is critical for the following slides and the work that we've done in this area. So let's have a look at the fundamental question of whether conversation in general has a business impact. Now, every business has its own KPI and business outcome, but the most common one is predominantly sales. So we wanted to understand this impact of conversation from a sales measurement point of view, and we wanted to use one that was familiar to the brands that we interact with. I'm sure many of you will be aware and familiar with MMM, but for those of you who perhaps not, it is a macro level time series analysis that is built to control for all the possible factors that could influence a sale. The main objective is to isolate the marketing component such that you can calculate an ROI. Now, for the work we've done in this area, we partnered with a very prominent vendor in this space, Newstar. And the reason why we chose them is that as part of their control variables, they include brand conversation as standard. Most of this is sourced from Brandwatch, but they use other inputs to that as well. And this allowed us to tap into a whole database of results of over 40 historical marketing mix models to try and aggregate and do a meta-analysis on the impact that earned conversation has had on sales. By analyzing these 40 cases, we saw that at the top end, a 10% increase in brand conversation could lead to up to a 3% increase in sales, which, given the size of the brands, and these tend to be the biggest in our kind of brand set, that's a pretty big increase. More so, the responsiveness to conversation differed by category, which we thought was very, very interesting. So on one end of the spectrum, you had e-commerce and insurance brands, where the brand loyalty tends to be a little bit lower, and hence they were a little bit more responsive in terms of uptake to changes in conversation. Comparatively, you've got the other end of the spectrum where you've got finance brands and tech brands, which people tend to be more brand loyal to those, and hence they were less swayed by the general conversation. So this gave us a clear proof that mentions of a brand had some effect on the bottom line sales. But we also wanted to understand the impact on other business outcomes as well as trying to isolate the conversation on Twitter and how that may have an impact that differs from the general conversation. So this led us to a series of causal experiments at the campaign level. And the aim was to look at how exposure to brand conversation on Twitter can drive behavioral and brand metrics. These metrics were compared to 3 distinct audiences, as shown here. There was a control group, and then there was a group who were only exposed to the adverts, and then a group that was exposed to the ads and conversation about the brand. For awareness, we found that those exposed to the ads and conversation drove a significantly higher lift compared to those who only saw the ads only and those who saw neither. And this wasn't just for awareness. We saw this across the funnel. It was true for both favorability and consideration. And this provided substantial evidence that conversation does matter for driving business outcomes for brands across the entire funnel. But still, for brands, conversation can seem a little bit exogenous and a little bit uncontrollable. So after finding some solid proof that conversation matters, the natural next question is, well, what what does affect conversation. So for this, we were able to return to our New Star study, and I want to highlight another significant benefit of their modeling approach, which is also a reason why we chose them as a partner. And this helps us to quantify the relationship between explanatory factors. So through this, we were able to see that all the business drivers of conversation, and learn that advertising was a controllable lever that a brand could pull to have a substantial influence on their conversation. Going a little bit further and looking at this through a lens of brand mentions per advertising dollar spent, Twitter was by far the most efficient channel, achieving almost 4 times more conversations per dollar invested when compared to other digital channels. And then to corroborate this outside of the New Star study, we did a huge meta-analysis where we collected over 130 different Twitter campaign results and observed that on average, the paid media campaign could drive over 105% incremental lift in conversation. And this was just for US studies. In other words, those exposed to ads were significantly more likely to tweet about the brand campaigns than those held back from seeing the ads altogether, ultimately validating that ads can help influence the scale of brand conversation, which, as we all know, and which we've shown from the previous slides, leads to driving business outcomes. So advertising is a lever for brands, but how exactly should they leverage advertising? What specifically should they do? Now, at this point, it's probably useful to introduce a framework that we've created to help us understand conversation, and this consists of 4 different pillars. Now, you've seen already outputs from both the volume work, that's the 105%, and then the impact work, which is the sales and the brand outcomes work that we just showed. But in order to understand how brands can affect conversation, we need to also look at the shape and the substance of that conversation, more easily described as the who and the what. Now, for the purposes of the rest of this presentation, we're just going to focus on the shape and the who, but there's more on the substance side of things towards the end. So we had a partner again for this work, and that was Pulsar. And through their tooling, we were able to segment the audience participating in the conversation. And this unearthed conversation shape as a potential lever that an advertiser could pull. Conversation shape is represented by these network graphs, which many of you may have seen before. And this basically visualizes the conversation and the audiences contributing to them based on who they follow on Twitter. Conversation shape falls on a spectrum. This is a key area that Pulsar's helped us to understand. Essentially, on one end, you have more fragmented conversations, signaling more varied audiences in the conversation. And then on the other end, you have more cohesive conversation shapes, where there's more alignment over the follower graphs of the participants. Now, it's really, really important to emphasize that neither end of the spectrum is particularly better. It just exemplifies and simplifies to the advertiser what they may need to do in order to boost conversation. So that it makes the distinction is in the levers that they must pull to improve based on their shape. I want to give one example, which was centered around a big product launch that happened on our platform, and hence it was targeted to a broad audience. So this resulted in a quite fragmented shape. So you can see here up to 11 different audiences on the left-hand side identified. Now on the right, we take the same conversation shape, but we overlay the ad exposure. So the yellow exemplifies people who actually saw the ad for this campaign, and the gray shows the people who did not. So as you can see, this being a broad targeted campaign, they did a fairly good job of reaching all the audiences, but there's some extensions, there's some areas that they obviously didn't catch from the initial campaign. We're also able to overlay in orange what we've called earned exposure. Now, these are the people who joined the conversation after seeing the tweet from an exposed user. So they didn't see the ad themselves, they saw the tweet from the people who saw the ad, which, as a reminder, is marked in yellow on both graphs in this slide. So in other words, the campaign ads prompted an initial wave of conversation on Twitter, which, due to the network connections, prompted further conversation and brought more audiences into the fold. Now, the learning and the potential learning here and potential recommendation here for the brand in question is that they could amplify the impact of their campaign by targeting these fringe audiences from the start, and then perhaps expanding its reach even further through the benefit of these owned exposures. So in particularly that group of audiences to the bottom right of these graphs, if they were to include that in the initial exposed user and the initial campaign, that could have splintered even further. So we believe our investigations have yielded some solid answers to these questions. Conversation about brands in general does drive business outcomes. Paid media can influence these conversations, Twitter being the most cost-effective channel there. And understanding conversation shape can inform targeting strategy and campaign optimizations. Now, at the start, I mentioned that this isn't the end of our journey here, and there's a lot to come next. So I thought I'd give you a sneak peek as to what that might look like. We've got some exciting work that we're continuing with Pulsar around substance. And this really gets into grips with the actual content of the tweet itself, since this is likely to differ by audience and likely to give us insight for future campaign strategy. It may also help us explain some of the patterns and trends we see in volume, impact, and shape. We're also doing some exciting work to understand some of the longer term effects and linkages of conversation through examining the patterns and similarities in conversation trends to brand metrics, accepting the fact that our previous proofs on business outcomes look more on the short-term campaign impact of conversation, but that may not be applicable to every single brand. And then finally, we know that conversation doesn't only exist on Twitter. So we're partnering with engagement labs who've got a strong footprint in this space to understand the role that brand conversations on Twitter have versus on other platforms versus offline in general. And the offline bit being the key factor here, because engagement labs have a strong proprietary conversation panel that we were looking to leverage. So hopefully that's given you a top line view of our work in the impact of conversation. I look forward to answering all your questions. Hopefully all that made sense. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.